And good morning or good afternoon. We're going to go ahead and get started. I'm very pleased to introduce our presenter, Dr. Gareth Potts. He was a 2012-2013 Urban and Regional Policy Fellow with us at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Dr. Potts will give a presentation entitled "The New Barn Raising: How Citizens, Policymakers, and Businesses Can Sustain Community and Civic Assets." This presentation is based on a comprehensive policy toolkit on the same topic. This toolkit will be published and available early next month on the German Marshall Fund website. In addition, this presentation will be recorded and also available early next week on the German Marshall Fund's website. At any time during the presentation, please feel free to ask questions. You can do so using the questions pane, which you can find on your webinar control panel. My name is Bartek Stardai, and I'm with the Urban and Regional Policy Program here at the German Marshall Fund. I'm based in Washington, D.C., but the German Marshall Fund has multiple offices in North Africa and in Europe. Before I begin, a little bit about the Urban and Regional Policy Program and about the fellowship program which Dr. Gareth Potts participated in. Working in dozens of cities and with hundreds of policy practitioners in Europe and North America, we facilitate a sustainable network of globally aware and locally engaged leaders by promoting the transatlantic exchange of knowledge and the incubation of innovative solutions for current urban and regional challenges. One of our longest running programs is our fellowship program. It gives small grants to practitioners, and these small grants allow practitioners to meet with their counterparts across the Atlantic and conduct focused research on a policy topic of their choice. And if you're interested, I should mention that our 2014-2015 application cycle is February 28th. As part of his fellowship to study policies and practices to sustain community and civic assets, Gareth traveled to Detroit, Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Baltimore, Washington, D.C. The policy toolkit, based on his research, proposes a number of short-term responses to public and civil society spending cuts and outlines a long-term vision to sustain community assets. Prior to undertaking our Urban and Regional Policy Fellowship, Dr. Gareth Potts worked in central government in the UK as a policy advisor in the Cabinet Office. Before that, he was Director of Research and Policy at the British Urban Regeneration Association, which facilitates the exchange of ideas, experience, and solutions relating to urban regeneration. He's actually now based in Detroit, Michigan. And with that, Gareth, I'd like to hand it over to you to begin your presentation.
Great. Thank you very much, Bartek. Okay. Okay, I'm hoping everyone can hear me here now. I'm just looking for my screen here, excuse me. So, thank you for that, Bartek. I want to really start off by setting a bit of policy context for the work that I undertook in the US. And the key policy contact was something called the Big Society. It was a personal initiative, real personal passion, as you can see from this quote here, of the UK Prime Minister David Cameron. And really, what the Big Society was about was kind of three central principles, ideological principles, about smaller government, about transferring power from central government to local government, giving communities, so neighborhood level, more powers. For example, if a pub or post office is to be sold, the local residents have a 6-month period in which they can concern. Also promoting social action, so voluntarism, philanthropic giving, charitable donations, and also kind of public service reform, so contracting out of social of government activities to social enterprises, including perhaps government staff setting up enterprises and perhaps contracting back to government. And I felt that community assets and civic assets, so things like parks, museums, art galleries, seem as though they should be right at the heart of this notion of the big society. However, alongside this, we've seen austerity cuts, public spending cuts, and the post-2008 recession. So really what that kind of gave way to a couple of key questions, really. There's some very sort of short-term questions around, well, how do we keep some of these assets that have traditionally had quite a large, relied quite heavily upon public sector money? How do we keep them going in the short term? So, wherever we can find money, where can we find money? But then there's a much more interesting question around, the longer term question around, well, even if there weren't public finance issues, how would these community assets look in the new big society? So with those questions in mind, I was fortunate to secure a GMF fellowship, and obviously came over to the US, and as Bartek said, picked these cities, and there was a sort of process. Really, I wanted to look at the US because of particularly at its sort of traditions of philanthropy, particularly sort of larger amounts of donations, strong traditions of volunteering, and also the sort of greater powers of at state level and city level, city government, city mayors. And so I picked these cities after sort of quite a lengthy canvassing of key people across the US. And I should stress this isn't the definitive list of the three areas that from the case studies I'd heard of at that time I felt that would make good for good studies. So you'll see I've called the toolkit the new barn raising. And really, it seems to really capture people's imagination, particularly in the US, I think, in that it kind of refers to this process here of, particularly in the 19th century, in farming communities in North America, but also to some extent in some Amish and Mennonite communities today, where people would all pull together in the community to sort of, raise this farming barn that sometimes would also be the focal point for community life at dances and, community activities around the year. And so really one of the central ideas running through the toolkit is that whether you favour a lot of public expenditure to support assets or whether you favour a little, that actually is in the process, and hopefully that will become clear. And then I've broken the toolkit up into raising awareness, raising money, and raising help, and by help I mean voluntarism. So I'll start off on the first section here. Really, I want to sort of talk about raising awareness, because I think even, when you've got assets, the first prerequisite really is to make sure that people use them. That's the aim of all this, is to have assets that are used and valued, not simply to fund something that no one wants to use. So I'll just quickly run through here a range of ways that sort of struck me as novel and interesting, both from the case study cities, but also from some sort of elsewhere across the US. And as you can see here, there are different ways, for example, telling people about what you do. So just sort of raising things through various signs here, from perhaps the slightly more expensive signs to the slightly sort of more cheap and cheerful and humorous on the right-hand side. In particular, it's important that you tell people about improvements that you make to your assets. And here, whilst these are not sort of marketing materials, in each of these areas there's been the sort of library here in Baltimore, for example, that in a sort of area that's not particularly well served with groceries, allows people to order groceries online and then come and collect them from the library. There's several libraries that do that. Right through to sort of in Detroit, a splash park that was funded by a large local corporation in one of the big parks. So it's letting people know about your improvements. Also engaging them. Here's some things from Baltimore, some what are called park passports, where kids are encouraged to sort of fill in these kind of booklets as they go around the park. It gives them a sort of idea of what to look for and says, what did you see? And there's some various sort of maths exercises in it. And it's just something that's fun for children to do, maybe even some adults. Same area of Baltimore. This is again produced by a local friends group, a very thorough map of one of the city's larger, really sort of historic parks, telling people of all the different things you can find in the park, and this is obviously just a small aspect of that. From maps to apps, this is Minneapolis Public Art. You can find out, you can have a little talk about different art from around the city, hear a bit from the artist. This is actually a St. Paul artist. Outreach, this is a very novel program by the Detroit Institute of Arts called the Inside Out. Around the metro area of Detroit, they have replicas of great works of art that are held inside the art museum, and it really does kind of catch your attention. I sort of saw several of these around the metro area, and it really does kind of make you stop and wonder what a sort of famous artwork is doing, planted sort of in a street or here by a sort of local town hall. Here's a variation on the bookmobile, the Maryland Zoomobile. So again, taking the message out, in this case to younger kids, about what assets are available on people's doors. You can show people with tours. So in Detroit, they have a tour for perhaps potential inward investors, showing them different parts of the city, and they always take in certain key assets from parks to markets, things like that. This is a guy who's in Baltimore who's put a camera on his cycling helmet and gone along one of the city's big trails that again goes through some sort of major parkland. And you can follow that, and you can clearly see that could have a wider application in terms of showing people around your library and putting it on YouTube. These kind of things. In Baltimore here again, the art museum. So this was the marketing team that did this, kind of a bar and disco in this really quite magnificent hall. Demographic of people to come and visit the museum, potentially to be sort of charitable donors to the museum. And then a few other examples here: professional sports team coming to the Red Wings coming to running a practice session in one of the Southwest Detroit's parks. Asleep with the Sharks at a kind of the aquarium in Baltimore, and then various sort of arts events, a cycle ride that goes through quite a lot of Baltimore parks each year. So these are events in themselves, but they're also just reminding people, hey, there's a park on your doorstep, you know, and this is what's here. And then these, I can't kind of include these. This one on the left here is Kansas City. It's these sort of artificial book spines made out of sort of very resilient material. They're 25 feet high. This is on the edge of the central library parking garage. And it really just does kind of, and they were selected by the community. And similarly here in Idaho, an example of just reminding people that the library's there in quite a sort of humorous way. So the other kind of element of raising awareness, obviously getting people to use assets is a key way of showing their value. But I think it's also important to make the case for assets, to perhaps particularly to funders, whether it be local politicians, whether it be local voters that are maybe voting on a specific funding measure for assets, and I'll go on to talk about that a little bit more in the money section, and potentially even other general sort of donors and charitable sponsors and companies. So in the toolkit, there's a various range of sort of tips, I guess, from people that successfully ran campaigns to argue the case for funding. This is the Friends of St. Paul Public Library, so one of the very best Friends groups in the US, sort of widely recognized for its strength. And what they do every year, they'll have a sort of, they use like a two-pager, an advocacy outlining what the library's done, its popularity, why it's worth, why it's worth public money. And the advocacy committee of sort of local great and good people who support the library will meet with the mayor and with the city council once a year in the run-up to the sort of final budget. And they say they've saved many millions over sort of the last sort of 10 to 20 years. So it's that process of kind of having something to show people that's punchy and having a kind of setting in which to do it can be very valuable. And a non-profit in Minneapolis called Minneapolis Swims has also taken this approach with the state government to secure a bonding, a sort of public bond that's helped to finance renovations of a local public pool. Also, make the case collectively, so make it concisely, make it consistently, but also make it collectively. And again, this example from Minnesota, where there was already a sort of Minnesota for City case, but what they did was actually also get together with sort of the state parks, with various sort of hunting, shooting, fishing groups to lobby for a statewide sales tax that would go for 25 years to fund these things, and it was put into the state constitution, so it's kind of safe from day-to-day politicking. You have to change the system, but it showed that what can happen if libraries work together with museums, work together with art galleries. They're all in the same business. Various examples of sort of strong visuals being made, again, as part of the case. In this case, from St. Paul, people arguing for a local urban farm and community garden, community park. They were comparing it with other parts of the city in terms of green space for children. And as you can see there, it's doing pretty poorly. So a good case for it getting investment, public investment, and various other kinds of support. And also comparing your city to others. This is parks and recreation funding in Baltimore compared to the national average, and you can see Baltimore second only to Detroit on that list. Really is powerful visuals as well. Also, various ways of including a human dimension. It could be simply meeting with officials. It could be doing short videos, but also in this case, kind of what this is. Words and in their own handwriting here, why they think the pool is so important, and they had lots of examples of these on their website, and they use lots of examples of these in their sort of promotional materials. Also, as part of this big new barn raising concept, there are other resources to hand as well, potentially. This is a case from Troy, Michigan, in Detroit metro area, where the local branch of a sort of an international marketing agency created this false campaign saying that it was focused around a vote on a special public tax to fund the library, a property tax, and they created this fake campaign saying that once you vote to close it, we're going to have a book burning party, and people were kind of taken in by this and outraged by it. Brilliant piece of kind of sort of negative psychology, reverse psychology, sorry. And so it actually in the event led to a big debate, and the residents voted very strongly in favour of the tax, and the library is now carrying on very successfully. So use the private sector, and also look to universities. So some of the maps I just showed you, of St. Paul, that was a local university student and postgraduate student, and also look to national umbrella bodies that deal with parks, with libraries, etc. And in the toolkit I outline about 20 of those. Some of these ideas. Sometimes this was an example. This example here did work. It's from Baltimore, and it's from the sort of late 1990s. There was a branch of the local public library, of the city public library, was to be closed. People protested. They realised there was a lot of support for it, and that led to them sort of pursuing a court case. But it wasn't ultimately unsuccessful as a court case, but it really galvanized local people and proved to themselves that they were popular. So protest does have a value, and that now runs as a very successful non-profit called the Village Learning Place. It's a library and various other things. Moving on now to, so I'm just over halfway now, moving on to the raising money section. I really want to talk about the different range of local tax mechanisms in the United States for supporting assets, and then a range of different ways in which different groups can contribute to assets, and also to try and highlight some of the wider benefits of having these different partners. Really, one of the key things was the importance of these different measures. So you see here residential property, commercial property, different types of tax. So for supporting assets, from sales tax I just mentioned, and that was quite different to the UK, where really the main tax is a sort of local council tax. That's actually set locally and retained locally. You can see here when I was here in 2012, there was a big vote around the Detroit Institute of Arts, a magnificent a special tax. So just like see that the newspapers were filled with discussion about the value of, do we want this? What does it do for us? To see people talking about it on the news, on the radio. And so I think that the UK, there is potential, for example, for the United Kingdom to have some of these types of tax, and I'll talk about that at the end. And even given the sort of stress on localism in the big society, even to potentially introduce some of these other types of taxes with a view to supporting assets. if you are using public money, it's clearly important to use that money efficiently to make it go as far as possible. And the toolkit does look at sort of lots of different examples of efficiencies that were achieved from sort of shared services between neighbouring parks departments to, for example, a parks department cutting back on its the grass cutting that it does, which can be good for biodiversity and can save the amount of time that a team needs to spend on cutting grass. It can be energy saving measures in various different types of buildings, putting some libraries using collection agencies to recoup fines, and again there are examples of that. Also, just adding to this different mix of different ways, you can use charges. Charges help to show people's value for something. They help make a contribution to something, and you need to sort of incentivize different elements. So different parks need to be able to keep the rents, or different assets need to be able to keep the rents if they're going to charge rents and fees that they're going to charge. Obviously, there are some things that are always deemed unacceptable as charges. So I've never found any examples of people being charged to simply enter a park or charged to simply enter a library. Thankfully, those things do seem to be off limits. But things like, for example, hiring a kayak or a bike or a greater acceptance, or a picnic shelter, seems to be much kind of greater acceptance of those type of things as a way of making a bit of money. And potentially also there was sort of a recognition. There's a little example here from St. Paul of a non-profit run recreation centre that makes needs-based assistance available. So you know, fees, but as long as equity is taken into consideration. Another example again here from St. Paul of just asking for a suggested donation, and there is some kind of evidence that a sort of well-structured and well-explained suggested donation can actually yield more money than a set fee. So people know that they're paying and that they're giving for something worthwhile. And you can make donation fun as well. This is an example from a library here. Kids put some coins in the top and they kind of rotate round. It's very good fun. And you can also potentially have this machine. These are made by a company that supplies them nationally and internationally. You can have corporate sponsorship for that again offsets the cost of buying that machine. Rental of space, I mentioned picnic shelters, but also sometimes much larger. These on the left here, you see the Tin Fish restaurant by Lake Calhoun in Minneapolis. Magnificent space, and this and another restaurant on another lake in Minneapolis, owned by the Minneapolis Parks Board. The space really is a kind of small gold mine in terms of its annual yield. It's incredibly popular, and the Parks Board takes a high share of that. Not everywhere has that kind of magnificent asset on its doorstep, but that is an example of making money. More generally, you can make some money and also add to the ambience of the asset. An example here from one of the sort of main sort of neighborhood libraries in Baltimore that has this cafe run by an established business in the city that's now opened an outlet here, and potentially even this case from Phillips Community Center in Minneapolis, where actually the rent of different tenants. It's run jointly by the Parks Board and the tenants on a volunteer basis, but it's actually a good way of actually keeping the building going. That was kind of the deal between the Parks Board and the different tenants and the local community groups for that going ahead. One of the major trends that I saw in the different cities is the move to non-profit organizations taking on city assets. So the assets remain in city ownership, but they're then managed by a non-profit, and that has various benefits in terms of freeing up. It makes it easier to make for the managers to make decisions without having to report back up a chain. It makes them available. City could still potentially make major improvements if they were needed. It allows them to attract charitable grants from foundations, from individual donors. And in this case, the market also raises money from rents because it has various food companies based around on its various premises. So this is a sort of food and flower market, vegetable market in Detroit, and it's growing. It's very popular, but also throughout the year. And another example of a non-profit that runs one of about a dozen of the St. Paul recreation centres that were kind of hived off by the St. Paul, city of St. Paul. And this again, it's a very, one of the things that if you have quite a lot of assets, it allows for specialisation as well. So this is a really specific football, soccer-based for the fun of it, and it really is quite different to sort of traditional recreation centre programming. They rely to some extent on fees, but they offer subsidy. They rely on charitable grants, and it really is sort of a very innovative program. So there are various kind of lessons that come out of this. So I should say also there are various other things that have been transferred. Zoom kits, you know, really quite a large range of activity is transferred to these non-profits. There were various lessons that came out of this in terms of needing to make sure that the advice that's given to people that are thinking of applying to run these centres, so various non-profits might be interested, various community groups might be interested, but you need to manage expectations. A lot of people are just not ready for this. It's not quite what they thought it would be. And similarly, from the city's point of view, they're well equipped, so they need to be able to pick the key things that to make conversation going forward, so that they're talking with only the organisations that are really able to take it on. And ideally, there'll be a competitive element as well, that it's not here for anyone. You have to compete to be given the right to manage these things. Various other pointers here about the length of contract. Right through to sort of various levels of managerial assistance, perhaps help with programming if that's needed, to kind of help these organisations on their feet, get on their feet if they need it. In Detroit, for example, the Mayor Bing, that was recently the mayor until late last year, Dave Bing, has set up a charitable foundation that looks to provide resources on an ongoing basis for the programming of the city's rec centres, and also potentially sort of improve physical improvements as well, but particularly sort of programming activities. And so that's looking to attract grants from corporations, charitable donations. And there are examples from Baltimore and from the Twin Cities of, particularly for parks, of separate foundations being set up of the city's parks, or for all of the, in this case, all of the city's rec centres. And you need to evaluate the progress with these things, with these different entities as they're managing them. I think the relevance for the UK here, the UK has seen a lot of asset transfer, but quite often what it has been is a kind of, the building has been sold off by the council, or it's old, and so it's much more about a kind of an urban renewal or a community development agenda, and those are very important agendas, rather than, say, this potential for public service reform of having a different type of service run from libraries and run from museums, etc. Also, asset managers and supporters, so friends groups, right through to sort of city local authorities themselves, can raise money in different ways, and the toolkit outlines these. From goods and different types of goods and services, so you can see here a naming of a bench. There's actually a small cottage industry I've discovered in the US for naming bricks. There's about 8 different companies that will allow you to have a service that allows you to put names of loved ones on bricks that can, for example, there, the bricks on that picture. And various different events as well that are held by these groups. That they run. That's the library I mentioned earlier, the non-profit library. Very popular with different age groups. You can see that the 2 kids seem to be having a good time there. And that's kind of part of a wider point, I think, that feeds into some of the sort of local philanthropic efforts that actually, whether you're someone that's really into philanthropy or someone that's really into socializing, there is a kind of, if you go to events like this Detroit Soup, which is people will give the proceeds from an evening where they'll have some food provided, and then they'll vote who want to give the money to. But the point is that, if you like, a norm of giving, but also they allow people to socialize. So it's both fun and a way of kind of establishing will want to go to things that are about giving, and you know, get people that want to give will end up going to these things. And you see here in the top right hand sort of people in the 25 to 40 age group. I think that guy in the right-hand corner there is perhaps a little bit older than that, but he's a sort of established philanthropist who's there talking to some of the younger people. They're typically professionals in these cities about the experience of giving and how to give with impact. Technology obviously also figured in the picture in terms of raising money. One of the things I think was very important was creating punchy videos. This is a non-profit that helps mow Detroit's various parks. And I think that's obviously an area where potentially different people could help provide support with people to get their video right, do these short videos, whether it's on. You see the importance of, again, linking into the social network of the area. So it's this point about giving can not only raise, it can use social networks and it can create social networks. And then here at the bottom, fundraising, Indiegogo was another one that featured quite highly. Here at the bottom, I've highlighted some other examples of online giving from different examples across the US that are just sort of starting to emerge in recent years, that are perhaps more focused on local government money and perhaps giving to sort of things like parks. So there's a kind of perhaps a little bit like Space Hive in the UK. Some interesting new organisations emerging. Another key player on the funding picture is Charitable Foundations, that perhaps local government typically doesn't do because perhaps the politicians and mayors are perhaps focused on the next 4 or 5 years of the electoral cycle, or focused on delivering key things like making sure there is a park and there is a library. Charitable Foundations have stepped in and done various different things, such as, for example, funding for a consultancy study that then led to a sort of charitable foundation that helps support St. Paul's parks. It could be examples in Baltimore of a community foundation giving support for movies in the park. So support for pilots of the Detroit Soup I mentioned and the Inside Out Arts program. Those are both supported by a Miami-based foundation called the Knight Foundation. And then you see here in this picture, it runs between the Eastern Market that I mentioned and the city's renewed, regenerated waterfront. And so it's not just an asset in itself, it's actually an asset that links key sort of civic assets in Detroit. I think the sort of relevance for the UK on this front really is that the foundation picture is much stronger. So the UK is probably for national foundations to kind of step in and play that role of championing innovation and support for assets. Businesses, I just quickly finish off on this section. Businesses, Minnesota has a long tradition of giving, say, a certain set percentage of pre-tax profits from companies to sort of local good causes, not just assets, but they can include assets, and they've often included assets. So the companies are only giving if they're making profits, and there's been a very sort of strong norm established over the last sort of, I guess, 50 or 60 years in Minneapolis, and there's an awards program that goes with that program. But more generally, unsurprisingly, businesses have been done, I think, made the most impact in terms of where they've done what they do best. So you saw the example of a marketing company helping out with Troy Library. It can be businesses giving over space, so anything from the Detroit Lions NFL team allowing for their stadium to be used for the local parks football programs to have their annual final, right through to a Southwest Detroit example of a local business that just allows a sort of community group to store its belongings. There's a little sort of library that's stored there so that people can bring it out when they need and bring out their materials. And bookshops sponsoring, say, author events in libraries. The two pictures here is Best Buy, where they've provided staff and various. They know what the youth market wants. Minneapolis is their headquarters, so they have this teen sex center in the central library. Similarly, again, the example of Home Depot, so a bit like B&Q in the UK, or Homebase, I guess, are helping out with various materials and staff that know how to kind of to do DIY that come along and help. In terms of moving to the sort of the final section on volunteering, just to look at sort of there's kind of the cut scenario, the short-term scenario, and really so it's really looking to sort of see, well, we're having to make cuts in staffing and cuts in activities. What can people step in and do? And Detroit has its Adopt a Park program. So I think over a third of the city's sort of 300 parks, typically smaller parks, have been taken on to different degrees by local groups and non-profits and local businesses. And people, will sort of try and help, particularly with the kind of physical maintenance and safe places. And national program called Kaboom that looks to put playgrounds into perhaps less wealthier areas, less well-served areas. So again, it's kind of trying to sort of step up the plate, if you like, in areas that perhaps are less well-resourced. But I think there sort of needs to be a certain degree of caution about just what can be achieved in terms of volunteers just trying to take over from cuts. This is a diagram that I produced for the toolkit that takes a case of a library, particularly a sort of a larger library, if you like, and you can see on the left-hand side here you've got, how many volunteers are likely to be available to this, and then on the bottom right, what's the typical skill and knowledge level required. And so kind of the message here really is that actually, it's things where you're likely in the top left-hand corner here, where you're likely to get volunteering is the things that, we perhaps typically associate with as reception. You have to remember that if you want to sustain a library, you need to think about sustaining it through, if you can't do it through taxes, then through donations, to sort of make sure that there is a core of professional staff still retained. You need a degree in museum studies to work in a museum, in information science to be a librarian, and horticulture and park management to work in parks. Those are the things. So I think it's very, very, you need to express caution about just how much volunteers can do on that kind of cuts level. So I think in terms of thinking about our big society, how assets can fit into the big society, it's a much more exciting agenda to think about supplementary volunteering. So you see here, so a docent, I guess they're called, or a guide in a museum of art. You can have interpretive guides in parks and sort of nature trails. People helping with reading in St. Paul libraries. Sports coaches in Minneapolis parks, they're trained by the parks people, but they're volunteers. Perhaps helping on Skype with people Skyping their relatives at senior centres, so city-run senior centres. There's various examples helping out with surveys, environmental surveys, various examples of how people can do things that doesn't sort of impinge upon what you'd expect from a typical good service, but that actually improve it. So perhaps in better times where public funds are healthy. And here's another kind of 3 examples here of a kind of words on wheels. It's individuals rather than a bookmobile going out to, say, old people's homes or perhaps certain people that want to use the famous High Line Park in New York, and then a kind of local user committee in St. Paul for the parks and recreation. So these are all useful in themselves, but I've highlighted in these kind of call-outs here the benefit to this supplementary volunteering that's over and above the actual acts itself. So if you have people going out into the community telling people that there's a library here, or if your volunteers generally are telling people about what's going on in the museum or these kind of things, those are routes for your asset into the community. They can allow you to feed messages out and to feed messages back in. Similarly, someone coming out and clearing snow on a freezing cold day, that's not just helping clear the park, it's actually a sign to potential donors and funders that this in the running of St. Paul parks, that's a degree of ownership for those people. So it's a sense of ownership for the asset. So I think this is a much more kind of encouraging agenda that people can kind of get enthused about. And I agree that perhaps we're not. This isn't very encouraging if your library's facing massive cuts somewhere. Okay. We can take some sort of positives out of some of. So this is another diagram here, a kind of more positive diagram. This is adopted from the city of Plano in Texas, which has a very strong volunteering kind of operation. And really it starts by saying, well, what do we need? And it talks to its staff who are perhaps a little bit suspicious about volunteers coming in. This is a sort of suburb of Dallas. and it says, you know, where are you actually overworked? Where would you need help? What projects have had to go on the back burner, and what ideas do you think there are, or what ideas have the public sent in that think we should be doing? And then then on this kind of, you can see these concentric circles here. It asks what kind of help has been done in the past. What have people typically done that we might think about using here? And then finally, sort of various legal and other barriers. So, you know, if someone's having access to lots of data from users, you know, are there local state laws, for example, that prohibit volunteers being given access to certain information? Are there safety concerns around sort of certain people doing certain types of, say, electrical repairs or building repairs? And kind of, are there various issues that sort of local trade unions might have in terms of fear that perhaps someone's job is being sort of usurped, issues like that. And then finally, the final slide, just sort of picking up on some infrastructure for what this Baltimore, the Step Up program, which has various elements to it. It's run by the mayor's office in the city, and it encourages volunteers to help with city services. In this case, you're looking here at a park, the Power in Dirt program. That's part of Step Up, one of the parts of Step Up, and various neighborhood groups have taken on. The city owns different vacant lots that has had housing on it, that perhaps has been returned to the city because taxes haven't been paid. So there's a lot of these sort of derelict lots across the city. But about 700 lots have actually gone to neighborhood groups. It could be churches, businesses, local community groups that now tend these under a sort of very informal contract. And in a few cases, they've taken on ownership of them. And we use them for sort of local gardens and for showing movies and things like that. And that's kind of a supplementary thing. It wasn't something the City Parks Department was doing, but it helps the city. And that's actually the Step Up program is part of a wider national initiative called the City as a Service, set up by Bloomberg, Mayor Bloomberg in New York, and so that sort of involves now hundreds of mayors' offices across the US, and sort of involves sort of one of the key features is that it has someone quite senior, a chief service officer. In this case, this is a picture here of a gentleman named Vu Dang from the Step Up program in Baltimore. The mayor's blessing pulls together the different departments that need to be involved to make these different initiatives work. Have the water turned on when they need it, and have access to sort of affordable water. And he makes the housing department produce very good accessible online maps telling people where the different lots are. So that's a kind of interesting model. And again, it focuses on supplementary volunteering. And I'll go on to touch on it. Basically is a brokerage that uses companies that will pay membership fees towards its running, charitable donations, foundation grants. And what it does is broker mid to senior level managers who will go and serve on committees in non-profits, not just asset-related friends groups and things like that, but it can include those sorts of things. And it's a way of bringing in highly skilled people, gives those people the training, and it also helps the non-profits to sort of acquire skills around strategy or fundraising or human resources on their boards or on special committees. So final slide, three things I think that as I say, I'm now based in the US, but the initial intention was always to sort of feed this back to sort of various people in the UK. And I think three things that are kind of fairly realistic moving forward, say over the next year, would be some kind of a marketing award to try and really kind of establish this idea of marketing. I feel I saw that in the UK, and I feel I've seen it in these examples here in the US. I think that would highlight work that's been done, things that work, marketing work that's been done on a very low budget. So that's one idea. The second idea, I think, is I mentioned that the UK has a council tax and a property-based tax, big society idea of greater powers for local government. the local government can increase that council tax by more than 2% if it wants to, but it has to have a referendum. It can increase it by up to 2%, but if it wants to do more than 2%, it has to have a referendum. And one of the cities on the south coast of England, Brighton, is thinking of doing this for, is planning to do this for, I think it's elderly care, wants to set about a 4% rise. And I think it would just be interesting to see if some of these particularly bigger cities were able to kind of pledge themselves to doing a kind of cross-assets council tax rise. It would just be council tax specific. And the reason I think if it was 2% and a referendum would be good is that it would really get people talking about, you know, the assets and simply making people aware of actually what exists in their city. So I think that's a plan, and it may be that some central government money or some charitable foundation money could be available to actually meet the costs of the referendum, because it could give quite costly affairs if they're done, say, aside of normal other elections. And then that Cities of Service has now been taken on board, and London, the Mayor of London was already experimenting with it and taking it on board. And I think I'd like to see, in an ideal world, either one of these cities say we're going to focus on assets and really focus on the type of volunteering things I was mentioning and looking to really take that forward to a new level, or perhaps even an asset strand that runs through all of them, and they kind of meet up to sort of explain and share different experiences. So, okay, that's me finished. I hope Bartek will now take over, and I'm happy to take questions or points. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gareth, for that presentation very much. And just to remind any questions that you have via the questions pane, and as well a reminder that this will be this webinar is being recorded and will be available on the German Marshall Fund early next week. So a few questions to kick things off for you, Gareth, in the few minutes that we have remaining.
Sure.
First of all, I'm struck by how many rich examples you found in the cities that you visited. And you talk about this a little bit in your toolkit, but part of the idea of assets and their sustainability in communities is how they're viewed, how they're defined, and how their benefits are seen. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit across the, maybe across the three cities, about how assets are viewed and defined, and about how they're seen in the community. Did you notice differences in the definitions of assets across the three cities? Can you speak to that point a little bit?
Sure. I think actually the term itself, I mean, it's kind of interesting. I don't hear American great deal. However, as soon as you start talking to people about the types of things, so you know, places that are communal, that are perhaps relatively open to most people, they very quickly, you know, quickly get it, and they clearly recognize they do have, you know, lots of these type of assets. I wouldn't say I see sort of really discern differences between the cities in terms of how assets are seen. I think, excuse me, sorry, I'm just drawing breath here. I think one of the things that I try to bring out in the toolkit is that I talked here about say assets that have had a lot of public money, but in the toolkit I identify probably about 30 different types of community asset and civic assets, so that may or may not be operated with some degree of public support. So I think that's something I really want to sort of flag up, that if people are wondering where cinemas are, for example, you know, they're clearly important. If people are wondering where sort of, you know, kind of high streets are and these type of things, so certain types of retail activity, you know, if you live on the coast, it might be that a pier, you know, is a very important local asset. So I try and sort of stress the sort of importance of different types of assets. So I'm not sure if that's kind of really helped to answer your question, but it's sort of a little bit about how assets are thought of, and a kind of a little bit about how I tried to describe them in the toolkit.
Yes. Thanks, Gareth. Another question, you have some recommendations for the UK context, but I'm sure that during your visits to the US cities, you identified some opportunities for improvement there. Can you speak to perhaps some recommendations that you would have for the cities that you actually visited, and perhaps for the civil societies or for the private or public sectors in any of the cities? Is there something that comes to mind?
Well, I think everything in the toolkit. I've actually, the toolkit doesn't really make any reference to the UK. So whilst this presentation, and whilst I want to engage with people in the UK with this and elsewhere in Europe and elsewhere in the world, the actual toolkit itself is written as if someone didn't need to know anything about anywhere else in the world. In terms of recommendations, I think probably the central thing I'd like to see in some of these cities, in all of the cities I visited really, is some kind of forum is alive. And I think and I don't mean by that a forum, I don't mean a sort of talk shop to people to just talk about these things. I mean a kind of really focused, perhaps even with sets of working groups to highlight the types of things I've outlined. So for example, if you want to find out about some of the sort of online fundraising mechanisms, there should be sort of work sessions that help people, community groups, to understand those technologies. There should be ways, for example, it could be an electronics retailers to help people show people how to make short videos, or for art students to get involved, creative people to get involved helping people with short videos, to help in fundraising. So I think it's that kind of, some kind of forum. So here in the toolkit, I've outlined, kind of all these different areas. But it would be great, I think, if the cities had something to take these discussions forward in their areas and tailor them specifically for their areas.
Great. And then another question about technology. A few of the examples that you mentioned in this presentation have to do with technology, whether it be apps or some other online forum. And you also mentioned the importance of online fundraising tools such as Kickstarter. What do you see as the future for the use of technology and kind of online marketing? Are the assets that you visited really getting in touch with these things? How do they view technology? Is it an opportunity? Is it a challenge? What's your sense in the places that you visited?
I think some people have really. I think one of the first things I should say about technology is, technology kind of it can be divisive. Not everyone has a smartphone, obviously. Lots of people do, but not everyone has a smartphone. So for public art, for example, just to be solely focused on people that can use a smartphone app to hear a bit about it, that's clearly slightly worrying if that was the case. And similarly, not everyone has an internet connection. So again, although public libraries are one of the main reasons that one of the main benefits. I think in terms of particularly sort of museums and larger kind of arts-related facilities are grasping the whole kind of apps world and allowing people to either they'll have sometimes they'll have their own technology that you can listen to someone talking about the artworks as you walk around, or increasingly to sort of tell you plug in your earphones and switch on your phone and listen as you walk around an art museum or something. Online fundraising, I don't think form of funding. I think it's a point of another way of reaching people, particularly the younger demographic, and using social media. Use people's networks of people they know on Facebook or people they know through Twitter to kind of put some of these punchy videos out. Having said that, using one of the things that people talk about with sort of online giving is people talk about clicktivism. So you click and give a bit of money, or there are online competitions where companies. One of the things I highlight in the toolkit are companies that have competitions where you get your friends and friends of your at your park or whatever to vote for you on a, say for example, $1,000 to whoever gets the most votes. And so I talk about those type of competitions. But the danger of that, and the danger of someone that just clicks on to a funding request is this clicktivism, where you just give and then forget about it. What you really want to do is to try and engage people. And I think that's something needs to be looked at more, is from that getting someone's attention with the short video. How do you keep them involved? How do you get them to volunteer? How do you make them your donors or your board members? So I think there's a range of different challenges there, both opportunities and perhaps potential worries of technology.
And a final question, just to wrap things up in the 2 minutes that personally perhaps plan to move this work forward?
So in terms of, I think you mentioned that the toolkit itself is going to be appearing sort of imminently. I'd like to see I'd like to sort of see some of the ideas taken up. I mentioned it in the different cities. I'd like to sort of look to think about establishing a network, particularly sort of a transatlantic network, to sort of keep these discussions going, particularly discussions with foundations, with corporate social responsibility groups, with people interested in the different asset types. And so, and some of that can be done online, some of it can be done through sort of transatlantic exchanges. So I think sort of taking it forward in sort of practical steps, potentially even a kind of, a dedicated non-profit. I'm hoping this sort of new barn raising kind of catches hold and kind of enthuses people, and kind of is a bit of a focal point, if you like, for all these kind of discussions. And hopefully people greatly improve on the work done for the toolkit. Hopefully they'll think it has some use, but they'll also look to sort of greatly improve on it through a network, and potentially through a sort of specialist non-profit or think tank even. So I hope that's some sort of, and if people are listening and want to discuss the contact details on the presentation, so please feel free to get in touch, and I'm happy to take these conversations forward.
Great. Thank you very much, Gareth, again for the presentation. And as I mentioned one more time, the entire toolkit, which will be published in early March. Thank you, everyone, for joining, and thank you again to Gareth. Take care.